Before we descend into the darkness, I want to ask a favour. If you enjoy this story, please use your hype points on this video. It helps the channel more than you possibly know. If you're listening on Spotify, leaving a review makes a massive difference. And if you'd like, comment what time it is and where in the world you're listening from. We absolutely love seeing where everyone is tuning in. And of course, if you enjoy the content, consider subscribing. Now let's begin. The city wakes the same way it always does. Bells mark the first hour of light, their tones clean and predictable, echoing off stone walls that have stood for generations. In workshops along narrow streets, apprentices pull back wooden shutters, letting in the cool air of early morning. The smell of bread begins its drift from ovens that started their fires while the sky was still dark. Cart wheels find their familiar grooves in the paving stones, and the sound is comforting in its regularity. This is Florence in the year 1348, and the rhythm of the day feels like every day that came before it. There is a quality to routine that makes a city feel permanent. When the same corners fill with the same voices at the same hours, when the pattern repeats day after day, it creates an atmosphere of stability. The cloth merchants open their stalls. The bankers settle into their counting houses. Families gather for morning meals in rooms where sunlight falls through windows at angles they could predict with their eyes closed. Everything moves according to a schedule that nobody wrote down because everyone simply knows it. This knowledge, this shared sense of when and where and how the day unfolds, is part of what makes a place feel like home. But on this particular morning, there is something slightly different, though most people would struggle to name it. It's not dramatic. It's not a change in the weather or an unusual sound. It's more like a hesitation, a brief pause in conversation that lasts just a moment longer than it should. A merchant stands in his doorway, speaking with a traveller who has arrived from the south. They are discussing wool prices and shipping routes, the ordinary commerce of the day, when the traveller mentions something he heard on the road. Strange fevers in the coastal towns, households going quiet. The merchant's hand, which had been gesturing to emphasise a point about quality and weight, stops mid-motion. He looks at the traveller's face, searching for signs of exaggeration or humour. The traveller's expression is neutral, factual. For a moment, the merchant feels something cold move through his chest. Then he laughs, a short sound that breaks the tension. Rumours, he says. Rumours are always cheaper than wool and travel faster. The traveller nods, perhaps relieved to have the moment dismissed. They return to their discussion of prices and deliveries, and the morning continues. Understanding how Florence usually holds itself together requires understanding the patterns that make daily life feel solid. The city is built on layers of routine, each one supporting the next. The guilds organise work into predictable categories. The cloth workers know their role, the bankers know theirs. The stonemasons, the leather workers, the merchants of grain and wine, all moving through days that follow templates established long ago. There is comfort in this structure. When you wake knowing what your day will contain, when you can predict where you will be at midday and who you will likely encounter, the world feels manageable. Churches provide another kind of structure, marking time not just in hours but in seasons and feast days. The calendar of religious observation gives shape to the year. Certain weeks call for certain prayers. Certain days require attendance, require specific foods, require families to gather. These are not burdens exactly. They are more like anchors, fixed points around which life arranges itself. When everyone follows the same calendar, when the same bells call people to the same rituals, it creates a web of shared experience that holds the community together. The physical closeness of city life adds another dimension to this sense of connection. In Florence, bodies are rarely far apart. The streets are narrow. The market squares fill completely during busy hours. In churches, people stand shoulder to shoulder. In workshops, apprentices work elbow to elbow with masters. In homes, families share rooms and beds, their breathing synchronized in sleep. This proximity is normal. It's part of what makes the city feel alive. The press of the crowd, the overlap of voices, the shared air warm with breath and conversation. These are the textures of urban life. They are signs of prosperity and community, evidence that the city is thriving. There is an irony gathering at the edges of this description, though it hasn't become visible yet. The very things that make the city feel vital and connected. The closeness, the shared spaces, the predictable gathering of bodies in markets and churches and workshops. These same things are about to transform into something dangerous, but that transformation hasn't happened yet. For now, the closeness still feels like safety. The crowd still feels like company. The routine still feels like a promise that tomorrow will arrive, much like today. The disease doesn't announce itself clearly. It arrives as talk, as stories, as information that travels along the same routes that bring goods and news. People who make their living on the roads, merchants and carriers and travellers, begin mentioning things they've heard. There are fevers in the port cities. Whole households have fallen ill. Some towns have marked houses with signs to warn others away. These reports arrive fragmentary and confused, filtered through multiple retellings, mixed with exaggeration and rumour. It's hard to know what to believe. Florence's first response to these whispers is a form of selective attention. The stories are noted, then reframed. The illness is somewhere else. It's in other cities, other regions, places with different circumstances. Perhaps the air is bad there. Perhaps the people live differently. Perhaps their water sources are contaminated. There are always reasons why misfortune strikes one place and not another. And finding those reasons is a way of creating distance, of maintaining the belief that what happens elsewhere won't happen here. This isn't quite denial. It's more like a sorting process, a way of managing information so that it doesn't overwhelm the ability to function. The conversations about these distant troubles follow a pattern. Someone mentions what they've heard. Others listen, ask questions, speculate about causes. Then someone offers reassurance. Florence is well governed. Florence has good physicians. Florence's climate is temperate and healthy. The conversation shifts to other matters. Business continues. The day moves forward. This pattern repeats across the city in dozens of conversations, each one arriving at roughly the same conclusion, that the problem, whatever it is not here. Fear, when it does begin to spread, doesn't do so dramatically. It's more like watching ink dropped into water, the way the colour diffuses slowly through the clear liquid, changing it so gradually that you can't point to the exact moment when the water stops being clear and becomes tinted. The fear works similarly. It seeps into ordinary interactions, a hesitation before shaking hands, a step backward in conversation, a decision to avoid a particular street without a clear reason why. These are small adjustments, barely noticeable individually, but they accumulate. Then the first cases appear within the city itself, and the nature of the situation changes. A household near the river goes quiet. The shutters stay closed past the hour when they usually open. Neighbours notice but don't immediately investigate. Perhaps the family's travelling. Perhaps they're attending to some private matter. Days pass. The shutters remain closed. Someone finally inquires and receives no answer. The silence from that house becomes a kind of information itself, though nobody wants to interpret it directly. At a workshop in the cloth district, a skilled dyer doesn't arrive for work. This is unusual because the man is reliable, known for his punctuality and dedication. His apprentices wait, unsure what to do without instruction. After a few hours, one of them walks to the dyer's home to check on him. The apprentice returns alone, his face pale, and says only that the master won't be coming. He doesn't elaborate. The other workers don't press for details. They find tasks they can do without supervision, and the day continues in a diminished way. The bells begin ringing with increased frequency. At first, this could be coincidence. People die. Bells ring to mark deaths. This is normal, but the number increases. The bells ring in the morning, at midday, in the evening. They ring from different churches, creating an overlapping pattern of sound that becomes part of the background of the day. It's still possible for a while to pretend this is unremarkable. The human mind is skilled at finding alternative explanations, at preserving the sense that things are fundamentally normal even when evidence suggests otherwise. People begin creating private rules for themselves, small protocols meant to reduce risk. These rules are personal, not official. No authority has issued guidelines yet. Instead, individuals make their own calculations about safety. One person decides to avoid the market square and instead sends a servant to purchase necessities. Another chooses to speak with neighbours only from a doorway, maintaining distance rather than inviting people inside. Someone else begins washing their hands more frequently, using soap and water in a ritual that feels like it might help, though the connection between cleanliness and safety is intuitive rather than understood. These personal rules reveal something about how fear operates when the danger is invisible. When you can't see the threat, can't point to it or track its movement, you create your own map of safety based on guesses and feelings. The mind needs some sense of control, some set of actions that might make a difference. So people invent strategies. They avoid certain streets, they limit their interactions. They change their routines in ways that feel protective, even if they can't quite explain why one route is safer than another, or why speaking from a doorway is better than speaking in a room. The fear at this stage is not dramatic. It's administrative. It's the feeling of reorganizing your day around an uncertainty, of making small adjustments that add up to a significantly altered pattern of living. The eeriness comes from the quietness of it, the way people change their behaviour without fanfare, without announcement, simply adapting to new invisible rules that everyone seems to be learning simultaneously. As weeks pass, the pattern of private quarantine becomes more visible. Households begin sealing themselves away, not because anyone has ordered them to, but because isolation seems like the only reasonable response to an illness that spreads through proximity. Curtains stay drawn, even at midday, when sunlight would normally fill rooms and warm floors. Windows remain closed despite the summer heat. The usual sounds of domestic life, voices and movement, and the small noises of cooking and cleaning become muffled or absent. Communication between neighbours shifts to accommodate this new distance. A question might be called down a stairwell instead of asked face to face. A reply might come back weaker than usual, as if the person answering is saving their strength. Messages get left at thresholds, written on scraps of paper or spoken through closed doors. The basic architecture of social life, which had been built on physical proximity and shared space, has to be rebuilt around separation and caution. This creates strange new problems. How do you help someone when help requires touch? How do you comfort someone when comfort means closeness? A neighbour falls ill, and the people who live nearby face an impossible choice. Offering assistance might mean exposing yourself to illness. Refusing assistance means abandoning someone who needs help. There is no good answer. Some people choose care, entering homes despite the risk, bringing food and water, tending to the sick. Others choose distance, closing their doors, keeping their families separate. Neither choice feels entirely right. The plague creates a situation where ordinary kindness becomes dangerous, where the most basic human responses have to be weighed against a survival. Love itself has to negotiate with fear. Families make decisions about who will care for a sick member. Sometimes one person volunteers, isolating themselves with the ill family member, while the rest of the household stays separate. Sometimes families stay together, accepting that if one falls ill, all might. Sometimes families fracture, with some members leaving and others remaining. These are not simple decisions. They involve calculations about duty and risk, about what is owed and what is reasonable, about the limits of courage and the strength of bonds that usually go untested. The social gravity of the city changes in ways that would have been unimaginable months earlier. Visitors, once welcome, become sources of anxiety. An unexpected knock at the door no longer brings curiosity or pleasure. Instead, it brings tension. Who is it? What do they want? Can they be trusted to be healthy? Even family members from other households become uncertain quantities. The embrace of a relative, once automatic, now requires thought. The kiss of greeting is skipped. The handshake is replaced with a nod. Public life begins to warp under this pressure. The markets continue because people still need food, but they change character. The crowds thin out, though never completely. There are always some who must go out, either because they have no one to send in their place, or because their work requires it. The people who do venture to market move differently. They hurry. They maintain distance from one another. Transactions that used to involve conversation and negotiation become brief and efficient. Money changes hands with minimal contact. Goods are set down and picked up rather than passed directly. Church attendance becomes complicated. For centuries, gathering for worship has been central to spiritual and social life. The rhythm of the week has been organised around these gatherings. But now the gathering itself is suspect. Some people stop attending, unable to accept the risk of enclosed spaces filled with breathing, coughing, praying people. Others attend more fervently than ever, believing that faith and ritual offer protection, or at least meaning, in a time when physical safety seems impossible to guarantee. The intensity of prayer increases, then gradually becomes exhausted. At first there is fervour. People pray for deliverance, for protection, for the illness to pass. They make promises and offerings. They attend services despite fear, or because of it, treating their attendance as an act of faith that might be rewarded. But as the weeks stretch into months and the illness continues, the prayers take on a different quality. They become routine. They become hollow. The words still form, but the expectation behind them fades. This isn't loss of faith exactly. It's more like exhaustion, the wearing down of hope through repetition without result. Trust becomes unstable in ways that reach into every interaction. People begin to suspect one another, not of malice, but of contamination. A neighbour's breath becomes a potential threat. A stranger's touch, even accidental, causes alarm. Clothing is suspect. Has that person been near the sick? Has that merchant come from an infected household? There is no way to know, no visible sign to mark the difference between safe and dangerous. So everyone becomes potentially dangerous. This creates a baseline of suspicion that makes ordinary human contact feel complicated and fraught. The tragedy of this shift is that it transforms ordinary kindness into something that requires exceptional courage. In normal times, helping a neighbour is simple decency, but when help might mean death, it becomes heroism. The recalibration is profound. Acts that should be automatic now require deliberation. The social fabric, which had been held together by countless small gestures of assistance and care, begins to fray as people withdraw into protective isolation. Yet the city keeps trying to be a city. This is important to understand. Florence doesn't surrender all at once. It keeps attempting to function, to maintain its routines, to preserve the patterns that define civic life. But the rhythm starts missing beats. A market day arrives and half the usual vendors are absent. A guild meeting is scheduled and only a fraction of the members appear. The mechanisms of daily life continue to turn, but they turn roughly, skipping and catching, producing something that looks like normalcy but sounds wrong. The breaking point arrives gradually, not as a single moment but as an accumulation of failures. Skilled workers begin to vanish, not all at once but steadily. A master carpenter doesn't open his shop. A physician stops making rounds. A banker fails to appear at his counting house. These absences create practical problems. Apprentices are left without instruction. Customers arrive to find workshops closed. The knowledge and skill that kept various enterprises running begins to disappear, person by person, and there are no immediate replacements. Officials attempt to maintain order through pronouncements and ordinances. They issue warnings about gatherings. They recommend practices meant to reduce contagion. They try to organise the collection of the dead and the cleaning of streets. But enforcement of these measures becomes impossible as the people meant to carry them out fall ill or flee. The gap between what should happen and what actually happens grows wider. Orders are given that nobody follows because there's nobody to enforce them. Guidelines are published that nobody reads because the structures of communication have broken down. The streets develop an uncanny quality. Corners that should be busy at certain hours stand empty. The sounds of the city change. With fewer people moving about, with fewer workshops operating, with less commerce and conversation, the acoustic environment transforms. Sounds travel farther because there's less noise to absorb them. A shout echoes where it would have been swallowed by ambient sound. Footsteps on stone become distinct and notable where they would have been part of a continuous murmur. The silence is not complete, which would be its own kind of remarkable. Instead, it's partial, punctuated, eerie in its incompleteness. The emotional centre of this period is a repeated realisation, arriving again and again in slightly different forms, that there is no fix coming. People kept expecting intervention. They expected the physicians to discover a cure. They expected the authorities to implement measures that would stop the spread. They expected God to answer prayers and lift the affliction. But none of these interventions materialise. The illness continues. The deaths continue. The mechanisms that should protect people prove inadequate or absent. This realisation doesn't arrive once and settle into acceptance. It arrives repeatedly, each time hitting with fresh force, because the mind resists accepting that the situation is simply going to continue without resolution. Within this context of ongoing crisis, two opposing currents run simultaneously through the population. Some people perform extraordinary acts of care. They nurse the sick despite the obvious risk. They carry food to quarantined households. They check on neighbours. They organise the burial of the dead when families are too devastated to manage it themselves. These acts aren't performed for recognition. There are no crowds to witness them, no authorities to record them. They happen in private, in closed rooms and empty streets, as individual decisions to maintain humanity in conditions that make humanity difficult. At the same time, others detach completely. They close their doors and refuse all contact. They decline to help neighbours. They save themselves and their immediate families, calculating that survival requires absolute separation. This isn't quite selfishness, or at least not simple selfishness. It's a different calculation about duty and risk, a decision that preserving some lives is better than risking all lives in attempts at rescue that might fail anyway. The moral landscape becomes complicated in ways that simple frameworks of good and bad can't capture. The hard choices reveal themselves in quiet arguments behind closed doors. A family debates whether to open the door to a sick relative. One person argues for admission, for care, for maintaining the bonds that define them as a family. Another argues for caution, for protecting the children, for refusing a risk that could destroy everyone. These arguments happen in low voices with pauses where people search for words adequate to the situation. There are no right answers. Whatever choice they make will feel wrong in some way. This is part of what makes the plague so corrosive. It forces people into positions where every option involves loss. A friend stands in the street outside a house where someone they care about is ill. They want to enter, they want to help, but they can't make themselves cross the threshold. They stand there, minutes passing, internal debates cycling through the same points again and again. Finally, they turn away, walking back to their own household with the weight of the decision, the knowledge that they chose safety over solidarity. This scene repeats throughout the city with variations. People standing in doorways at thresholds, at the edges of rooms, unable to move forward and unable to feel settled about moving back. The plague functions as an invisible storm. This metaphor captures something essential about the experience. In a visible storm, you can see the rain, watch the wind bend trees, track the movement of clouds. You can point at the danger, but the plague offers no such clarity. You can't see it approaching. You can't watch it pass. You only see its wake, the effects left behind. A closed house, a missing person, a funeral procession. The evidence of the storm without the storm itself visible. The bells become a constant presence, ringing so frequently that they blur into background sound. In normal times, bells mark deaths with weight and meaning. Each toll represents a person, a life ended, a community taking note of loss. But when the bells ring constantly, they lose their individual significance. They become atmospheric, like weather. The sound is still there, still marking deaths, but the mind can't hold each one separately. They merge into a continuous acknowledgement of ongoing catastrophe. Traditional mourning rituals compress or vanish entirely. The customs that usually surround death, the gathering of family and friends, the prayers and processions, the careful preparation of the body, the communal expression of grief, all of this becomes impossible or dangerous. Families can't gather because gathering spreads illness. Bodies can't be prepared with traditional care because touching them is risky. Burials happen quickly, with minimal ceremony. Names get passed along in lists instead of spoken stories. The dead are noted, but not properly mourned, adding a layer of incomplete grief to everything else. There is an image that recurs, a visual motif that captures the strange quality of this time. Midday sunlight falling on a street that should be full of people. The light is warm and bright. The stones glow with it. The air is clear, but the street is empty, or nearly so. Maybe one figure moves through the distance, walking quickly with their head down. The scene should be pleasant, sunshine in a beautiful city, but instead it feels muted, as if wrapped in cloth, as if the normal connection between light and warmth and human activity has been severed. The city continues to exist physically, but its animating spirit has withdrawn. As the plague continues, a social split becomes visible between those who can leave and those who cannot. Some people have country estates or family in rural areas. They gather what they can carry and flee the city, hoping that distance will provide safety. The roads out of Florence fill with carts and walkers, people moving away from the density of urban life towards spaces where air is clearer and neighbours are farther apart. This flight is presented in some contemporary accounts as cowardice, but it's more complicated than that. It's a reasonable response to a disease that spreads through proximity. If closeness is dangerous, then distance makes sense. But leaving requires resources. It requires somewhere to go, the means to travel, the ability to abandon work and property. Many people lack these options. They stay not because they're braver or more faithful, but because they have no practical alternative. Their work ties them to the city. Their poverty prevents travel. Their obligations to family or employers or creditors hold them in place. The city becomes divided between those who have the luxury of flight and those who must endure. Even among those who stay, patterns diverge. Some continue working because they must, going to markets and workshops, maintaining the minimal economic activity that keeps the city from complete collapse. Others withdraw as much as possible, leaving their homes only for essential errands, creating a life of dangerous necessities where every trip outside involves calculation and risk. The social landscape fractures into different strategies for survival, each with its own logic and its own costs. There is a detail from this period that some storytellers later emphasized. Though the historical record is imperfect, some people, particularly those with resources and imagination, attempted to preserve sanity and structure through deliberate routines. They created private schedules. They told stories to one another. They maintained rituals of dining and conversation, constructing small islands of normalcy within the larger chaos. This response can seem escapist, a refusal to face reality, but it can also be seen as a form of resistance, an insistence that human culture and connection matter even when, especially when, survival is uncertain. These attempts at maintaining civilization in miniature don't solve anything, but they provide a framework for endurance. The plague wave begins to ease, though this happens unevenly across the city. Some neighbourhoods experience a reduction in new cases while others remain heavily afflicted. The pattern of retreat is as unpredictable as the pattern of arrival was. There's no clear turning point, no moment when someone can announce that the worst is over. Instead, there's a gradual thinning of the crisis, a slow recognition that deaths are becoming less frequent, that more households are reopening, that the streets are beginning to fill again. Survivors step back into public space tentatively, as if the city has become unfamiliar. In some ways it has. The commercial landscape has changed. Shops reopen with different names on the signs because the original owners are dead and relatives or former apprentices have taken over. Some businesses simply don't reopen. The buildings remain, but the enterprises that filled them are gone. Walking through familiar streets produces a strange doubling effect, where the physical space is recognizable, but the human activity within it has shifted. Guilds reorganize around whoever remains. The hierarchies that existed before, based on seniority and skill and family connection, have been scrambled by the plague's random culling. Masters are dead. Apprentices find themselves promoted into positions they're not quite ready for. New partnerships form, out of necessity. The work continues, but with different hands performing it, different voices making decisions. The institutional memory of how things should be done has gaps where people who carried that knowledge are simply absent. The emotional tone of this period is peculiar. There's relief that the worst seems to be passing, but the relief is complicated by awareness of what has been lost. Families search records trying to account for everyone, trying to construct a full picture of who survived and who didn't. Sometimes the information is clear, sometimes it's maddeningly unclear, with people unaccounted for who might be dead or might have fled or might be recovering in isolation somewhere. The uncertainty makes it hard to properly grieve. Empty chairs become permanent. This is both literal and metaphorical. At actual tables, chairs that were occupied by people now dead remain empty, and the family that gathers around the table has to decide whether to remove the chair or leave. It is a kind of memorial. In workshops and counting houses, positions that were filled are now vacant, and the organisation has to adapt around the absence. In churches, familiar faces are missing from the congregation. The city is full of these gaps, these spaces where people should be, but aren't. There's a sense of the city walking forward with a limp, a permanent alteration in its gait. Florence will continue. Cities are resilient in ways that individual lives are not, but it will continue differently, marked by what happened, carrying the experience forward into all its future days. The plague hasn't just killed people, it has changed the relationships between the people who remain, altered the texture of trust and proximity, left everyone with a new understanding of how quickly the normal can dissolve. The practical consequences of the plague reshape Florence in ways that become clear only gradually. Labour becomes scarce. Before the plague, workers were abundant enough that their bargaining position was weak. Employers could set terms, wages were low, conditions were whatever employers chose to make them. But when a significant portion of the workforce dies, the survivors find themselves in demand. They can ask for better wages. They can refuse unreasonable conditions. They can move between employers seeking better terms. This shift in economic power happens not through organisation or activism, but simply through scarcity. There aren't enough workers to do all the work that needs doing, so the workers who remain become valuable. Property and roles shift. as inheritances work their way through a population thinned by death. People who expected to wait decades to inherit find themselves suddenly in possession of houses, businesses, land. Young people take on responsibilities that would normally have gone to someone older. Social positions that were fixed suddenly become fluid. This creates opportunity for some, particularly those who survive with skills and ambition. But it also creates dislocation, a sense that the social order has been shuffled in ways that may or may not be fair or sensible. Public health thinking begins to change, though this happens slowly and incompletely. The plague forces a recognition that disease can spread through communities, that individual illness isn't just a private matter, but a public concern. This awareness doesn't immediately produce effective public health measures. The understanding of how disease actually spreads remains imperfect. But there's a new attention to questions of sanitation, to the management of the sick, to the need for some kind of civic response to epidemic illness. These ideas will take generations to develop into actual functional public health systems, but the plague plants seeds that will eventually grow into new ways of thinking about community health. The emotional consequence is perhaps deeper and less tangible than the practical consequences. The city learns something it would rather not have learned, that catastrophe can arrive without spectacle. That disaster doesn't always announce itself with drama. Sometimes it arrives quietly, invisibly, in the air, in routine interactions, in the ordinary flow of daily life. This knowledge is unsettling in a particular way. Dramatic catastrophes, earthquakes and fires and invasions at least have the quality of being distinct from normal life. You know when they're happening. You can point to them. But an invisible catastrophe, an illness that spreads through the very closeness that makes city life possible, this is harder to hold at a distance. It reveals that the normal itself can be lethal, that the routines that feel safe can harbour danger. The people who survive carry this knowledge forward. They don't forget what happened. They can't forget. The memory is embedded in the changed landscape of the city, in the missing faces, in the new arrangements of work and family and community. They tell stories about what they experienced, and these stories spread beyond Florence, becoming part of how people think about plague, about cities, about the fragility of ordinary life. Some of these stories emphasize moral lessons, framing the plague as punishment or test. Others focus on practical details, documenting what happened for the benefit of future generations who might face similar trials. There is a closing reflection worth making, a return to the theme that opened this account. Florence tried to stay normal. This was its instinct and its pattern. When the first rumours arrived, the city attempted to continue as usual. When the first cases appeared, people adjusted their routines, but tried to maintain the basic structure of daily life. Even as the plague deepened, even as deaths multiplied, there was a persistent effort to preserve normalcy, to keep working, keep gathering, keep following the patterns that defined civic existence. This wasn't foolish exactly. It was human. It was the understandable desire to believe that the familiar will continue, that tomorrow will resemble yesterday, that catastrophe is temporary and normalcy is the natural state to which things will return. But the lesson the plague teaches, the hard truth it embeds in the survivor's understanding, is that disasters aren't always crashes or fires, or moments of obvious rupture. Sometimes they're gradual tightenings, slow constrictions of possibility, progressive narrowings of what is safe or feasible. Sometimes the scariest part isn't a single terrible moment, but the extended duration, the way weeks become months, and the emergency never quite resolves, just continues at a level that becomes the new baseline of existence. Sometimes the most unsettling realization is how long people can keep pretending that the situation is temporary, that relief is coming, that normalcy is just around the corner waiting to be reclaimed. Florence in 1348 learned to live with uncertainty extended beyond any reasonable limit. It learned that cities, for all their permanence and structure, are fragile assemblies held together by human presence and activity. Remove enough people and the assembly begins to fail. Disrupt enough routines and the structure wobbles. The physical buildings remain, the stones and streets and churches, but the city as a living thing requires the people and their patterns. And when those patterns break, the city breaks with them, at least partially, at least temporarily. The bells, which rang so constantly during the plague months, eventually return to their normal rhythm. They mark hours and deaths in the measured way they always did, before the time when death became too common to measure meaningfully. The streets refill, though not to their former density. The markets resume, though with changed participants and altered relationships. Work continues, adapted to new circumstances. Families reorganise around their losses and continue forward because there's no alternative to continuing. The fog of the plague lifts, but it lifts slowly, revealing a landscape that is both familiar and changed. The same sun illuminates the same stones, but the shadows fall differently. The same bells ring from the same towers, but their sound carries different associations. The same river flows past the same walls, but the city it flows through is no longer quite the same city that existed before. In the quiet of evening, when the day's work is done and the household settles into rest, there is time for reflection on what was lost and what remains. The mind, which had been so occupied with immediate survival, with the practical questions of how to stay safe and how to continue, now has space to consider the larger shape of what happened. This reflection doesn't produce resolution. The plague's meaning isn't simple or singular. It means different things to different survivors, depending on their experiences and their losses and their frameworks for making sense of suffering. But there is a shared awareness, unstated but present in the texture of social interaction, that something fundamental has shifted. The relationship between people and their city, between individuals and community, between the familiar and the dangerous, all of these have been recalibrated. The casual trust that allowed people to move through crowds without thought, to welcome strangers without hesitation, to assume that tomorrow would be safely similar to today, that trust has been complicated. It's not gone. People still gather. They still trade and talk and form connections. But there's a new layer of awareness, a recognition that the ordinary can become extraordinary, that the safe can become dangerous, that the solid can dissolve. As night deepens and the city quiets, the story of the plague settles into memory, joining the other stories that Florence carries about itself. It becomes part of the city's history, a chapter that will be told and retold, interpreted and reinterpreted, used as a lens through which to view later challenges. The physical experience of living through those months will fade as survivors age and eventually die, but the story will remain, passed down through generations, adapted to new contexts, serving as a reminder of what cities can endure and how fragility and resilience exist side by side. The bells fade in imagination, their tolling becoming distant and then silent, the streets quiet in memory, the crowded, urgent days of the plague giving way to the slower, more spacious days of recovery and rebuilding. The mind which has been holding all of this, the fear and the loss and the gradual return to something like normal, begins to release its grip on the details, allowing them to blur and soften. The sharp edges of specific moments smooth into a general sense of what was survived, what was endured, what was learned. The city sleeps now, if cities can be said to sleep. The guards on the walls continue their watch. The night workers in bakeries tend their ovens. But the general life of the city, the commerce and conversation and movement that fill the daylight hours, all of that has paused. The pause is normal, expected, part of the rhythm that organises time. Tomorrow the city will wake again. The bells will mark the hours again. The streets will fill again. But tonight there is stillness, and in the stillness there is rest, and in the rest there is the possibility of healing. However slow, however incomplete. The story drifts away like fog thinning into morning light, the details dissolving, the emotional weight lifting, leaving behind only the faintest sense of what was carried, what was felt, what was survived. The mind lets go of the specific images, the particular faces, the individual moments of choice and consequence. What remains is a gentle awareness that people have endured hard things before, that cities have been tested and have continued, that the pattern of disruption and recovery is old and deep, and perhaps contains some comfort in its very familiarity. The quiet deepens. The story completes its arc from morning to night, from crisis to aftermath, from fear to a kind of peace. The invisible storm has passed. The ordinary morning, which started this account, has travelled through months of transformation and emerged on the other side, changed but still recognisable, still capable of beginning again. The city that tried to stay normal learned that normal is more fragile than it appears, but also learned that after the breaking comes rebuilding, after the scattering comes regathering, after the loss comes the slow work of continuation. And now, with that lesson held gently, without urgency, without demand for immediate application or dramatic conclusion, the narrative can rest. The details can fade into the general impression of a difficult passage completed. The mind can release its attention from the specifics of Florence in 1348 and drift toward its own rest, carrying perhaps some small awareness that human communities have always faced trials, always struggled with invisible threats, always had to negotiate between the desire for normalcy and the necessity of adaptation. The last image is simple: light fading from a window, shadows extending across stone floors, the day completing its cycle as days have completed their cycles for as long as cities have existed. There is no drama in this ending, only the quiet acceptance of time passing, of stories ending, of consciousness moving towards sleep. The bells are silent now, the streets are empty, the city rests in the way that cities rest, never entirely still, but reduced to its nighttime minimum, waiting without anxiety for the return of light and activity. And with that image, held loosely, without effort, the mind too can rest, can release its engagement with this historical moment and allow sleep to arrive in its own time, gentle and unhurried, like fog settling into valleys, like darkness filling a room when candles are extinguished, like the natural ending of a story that has reached its conclusion and need not continue beyond this point of peaceful resolution. The next story is about to begin. Please relax and enjoy. The story of the Franklin expedition begins not with drama, but with preparation. In May of 1845, 2 ships departed from England, carrying 129 men into the Arctic. These weren't merchant vessels or fishing boats hastily converted for exploration. HMS Erebus and HMS Terror were purpose-built naval ships, reinforced against ice, equipped with steam engines that could propel them through calm waters when wind failed, and stocked with provisions calculated to last 3 years. The planning behind this expedition reflected the scientific confidence of the mid-19th century, the belief that careful measurement, adequate supplies, and disciplined naval routine could solve the puzzle of the Northwest Passage, that fabled route through the Arctic archipelago connecting the Atlantic and Pacific Oceans. The ships carried tinned foods, a relatively new preservation technology that promised to keep meat and vegetables edible for years. They carried coal for the steam, engines and for heating. They carried navigational instruments, charts based on previous expeditions, and a library of books to occupy the crew during the long Arctic winter when darkness would make outdoor work impossible. The expedition was led by Sir John Franklin, a veteran Arctic explorer, and the crew consisted of experienced sailors and officers who understood that Arctic travel meant periods of waiting, periods of cold, and the necessity of maintaining morale through routine and discipline. Everything about the departure suggested competence and control. The last confirmed sighting of the expedition came in late July 1845, when whalers encountered the ships in Baffin Bay, the body of water between Greenland and the eastern coast of what is now the Canadian Arctic archipelago. The whalers reported that the crew seemed in good spirits and well prepared. Franklin and his men were waiting for favourable conditions to push westward into Lancaster Sound, the eastern entrance to the network of channels and straits that make up the Arctic archipelago. After that encounter, the expedition sailed into a region where no regular shipping routes existed, where the handful of previous explorers had been the only European visitors, and where the ice conditions changed from year to year in ways that no amount of preparation could fully anticipate. This moment, the ships disappearing beyond the edge of regular maritime traffic, marks an important transition in understanding how isolation works in extreme environments. In 1845, there was no radio communication, no satellite tracking, no way for a ship in the Arctic to signal back to Britain except by leaving messages in cairns or sending boats back with dispatches. Once the expedition sailed west from Baffin Bay, they entered a communication void. Their presence in the Arctic became a matter of inference rather than observation. Britain would have to assume the ships were proceeding according to plan, working their way through ice and open water channels, making decisions based on conditions that no one back home could monitor. The Arctic archipelago itself presents a particular kind of navigational challenge. Unlike the open ocean, where direction is primarily a matter of latitude and longitude, the Arctic channels form a maze of possible routes. Some channels are relatively deep and ice-free in summer. Others remain choked with multi-year ice that doesn't melt seasonally, but persists year after year, growing thicker and more resistant to navigation. The shape of these channels, the pattern of currents, and the movement of ice all interact in complex ways. A channel that appears navigable one year might be completely blocked the next. The expedition would have been making decisions based on incomplete information, trying to balance the goal of pushing westward with the reality of what the ice would permit. The first Arctic winter would have arrived with a kind of inevitability. As autumn progresses in the high Arctic, the sun drops lower in the sky each day until eventually it doesn't rise above the horizon at all. This polar night isn't complete darkness. There's twilight around midday, and the moon and stars provide some illumination, but it transforms the environment into something fundamentally different from the summers when the sun never sets. The expedition would have found a protected anchorage, frozen the ships into place deliberately if they weren't already held by ice, and shifted into winter routine. Life aboard ships frozen in Arctic ice follows patterns dictated by conservation and endurance. The crew would have reduced the use of heating fuel to stretch supplies, which meant living in temperatures cold enough that condensation from breathing would freeze on the interior walls of the cabins. Daily routines structured time, watches to maintain, navigational observations to record, equipment to maintain, and the careful management of food stores. Officers would have organised activities to keep the crew occupied: theatrical performances, classes, hunting expeditions when weather permitted. The psychological challenge of Arctic wintering isn't primarily about isolation, though that's certainly a factor. It's about the combination of confinement, darkness, cold, and the knowledge that you're entirely dependent on the supplies you brought with you and the competence of the people around you. The expedition's first winter was likely spent at Beechey Island, a small island off the southwest coast of Devon Island in the Canadian Arctic. Archaeological evidence found later confirms that the expedition wintered there during 1845 to 1846. 3 crew members died during that winter and were buried on Beechey Island in carefully constructed graves that the permafrost has preserved remarkably well. When these graves were exhumed in the 1980s as part of scientific investigation into the expedition's fate, the bodies were found in startlingly good condition, maintained by the deep cold that prevents decomposition. The deaths themselves weren't necessarily unusual. Respiratory illness and other ailments killed crew members on many Arctic expeditions, but they marked the beginning of the expedition's gradual attrition. The transition from first winter to second summer would have brought renewed hope. As the sun returned and temperatures rose, the ice would have started to break up, creating leads, channels of open water that allowed ships to navigate. The expedition would have been searching for routes westward and southward, trying to find a path through the archipelago that would eventually connect to known waters in the western Arctic. We know from the historical record, pieced together from the note found later at Victory Point, that the ships did make progress. They navigated down Peel Sound and Franklin Strait, travelling south along the eastern side of Prince of Wales Island and eventually approaching King William Island. This is where geography and ice conditions combine to create the expedition's central crisis. King William Island lies in a region where ocean currents and wind patterns tend to compact sea ice. Unlike some parts of the Arctic, where ice breaks up and disperses each summer, creating navigable routes, the waters around King William Island often remain choked with ice, even during the warmest months. In September 1846, as the Arctic summer was ending and the new ice of autumn was beginning to form, HMS Erebus and HMS Terror became trapped in the ice northwest of King William Island. The historical record, again from the Victory Point note, gives the precise date. September 12th, 1846. The ships were beset, a nautical term that describes being surrounded and held by ice, unable to move. Being beset in ice isn't immediately catastrophic. Ships designed for Arctic exploration, like Erebus and Terror, were built with reinforced hulls to withstand ice pressure. The crews would have initially expected that the ice would break up in the following summer, allowing them to continue their voyage. This is a common experience in Arctic navigation. Ships frequently get trapped temporarily, wait out the winter, and proceed when conditions improve. The concerning aspect of the Franklin expedition situation was location and timing. They were beset in an area known for heavy ice, late enough in the season that they couldn't attempt to free the ships before winter set in, and far from any known refuge or supply depot. The second winter, from 1846 to 1847, would have been markedly different from the first. The psychological geography had shifted. At Beechy Island, the crew had been at the beginning of their journey, full of supplies following a plan. Now they were stuck in place, consuming supplies without making progress, in a location where the ice conditions were less predictable. The routine would have continued, watches, maintenance, rationing, attempts, to keep morale stable, but with the growing awareness that their margin for error was shrinking. Time becomes strange in situations like this. Each day resembles the previous one. The sun rises and sets according to the season, but the ships don't move. The ice surrounding the vessels becomes a landscape, something to walk on rather than sail through. Crew members might venture out for hunting, for exercise, for scientific observations, but always returning to the same fixed point. The ships designed for motion become stationary structures. The familiar creaks and movements of a vessel under sail are replaced by the sounds of ice, shifting and grinding against the hull, of wind across a static surface, of human activity contained within wooden walls. The expedition's provisions, so carefully calculated, would have been monitored with increasing precision. 3 years' worth of food sounds generous, but that calculation assumed the expedition would be making progress, potentially resupplying through hunting and eventually emerging into known waters where they might encounter other ships. Trapped in ice, consuming stores without moving forward, the mathematics of survival shifted. Officers would have been calculating consumption rates, estimating how long supplies would last, considering options for rationing or for supplementing with hunted game. The tinned food, which seemed so innovative in 1845, may have become a source of problems. We know from later analysis that the solder used to seal the tins contained lead, and that lead poisoning was likely a contributing factor to the expedition's troubles. Lead poisoning is insidious. It accumulates over time, causing symptoms that might initially seem like ordinary illness or fatigue. Cognitive effects include difficulty concentrating, mood changes, and impaired judgment. Physical symptoms include weakness, digestive problems, and anemia. For a crew trying to make critical decisions about survival in an extreme environment, the gradual cognitive impairment from lead poisoning would have been particularly dangerous, though they would have had no way of identifying the cause. The note found later at Victory Point provides our only direct communication from the expedition, and it's a document that reveals history in layers. The note is a standard Admiralty form, pre-printed with spaces to fill in information about the ship's position and circumstances. The first entry, dated May 28, 1847, is optimistic in a bureaucratic way. It records that the ships had wintered at Beechey Island and had subsequently been beset in ice. It notes that all well and that the party consisted of 2 officers and 6 men under the command of Gore and Defoe. This was likely a sledging party sent out to explore the surrounding area and deposit the note in a cairn as a record of the expedition's position. The phrase "all well" is haunting in retrospect, but it may have been accurate at the time. In May 1847, despite being trapped in ice for 8 months, the expedition might genuinely have been in reasonable condition. Supplies still adequate, crew still disciplined, hope still rational that the coming summer would break up the ice. The note was doing what such notes were supposed to do, providing information for potential rescue parties, establishing a record of movement and position, maintaining the documentation expected of a naval expedition. The second entry on the same note, written in the margins and dated April 25, 1848, nearly a year later, tells a completely different story. This edition records that HMS Erebus and HMS Terror were abandoned on April 22, 1848, having been beset since September 12, 1846. It notes the total loss of life to that point: 9 officers and 15 men dead. It records the death of Sir John Franklin on June 11, 1847, and it states that the survivors, now numbering 105, were setting out on April 26, 1848, heading south toward the Back River under the command of Captain Crozier and Captain Fitzjames. The act of amending this note with such drastically different information speaks to the deterioration of circumstances. The expedition had survived a second winter trapped in ice. The summer of 1847 had failed to free the ships. They had endured a third winter from 1847 to 1848, watching supplies dwindle and crew members die. The decision to abandon the ships, to leave the only shelter they had, indicates that remaining aboard had become untenable. Perhaps the ships were being crushed by ice pressure. Perhaps supplies were nearly exhausted. Perhaps the deaths were accelerating, and the officers judged that the only chance for survival was to attempt to reach the mainland and travel overland to known outposts hundreds of miles to the south. The mention of Franklin's death in June 1847, more than a year and a half before the ships were abandoned, raises questions about leadership and decision-making during the expedition's final phase. Franklin was the expedition leader, an experienced Arctic explorer whose judgment would have been central to planning. His death would have transferred command to Captain Crozier, who then had to manage an increasingly desperate situation without the benefit of Franklin's experience or the authority structure that had been established at the expedition's outset. The decision to abandon ship and march south represents a calculated gamble with survival. By April 1848, the expedition had been trapped for a year and a half. They had consumed a significant portion of their provisions. The ice showed no signs of releasing the ships. The hope would have been that by marching overland, the survivors could reach the Back River, which flows into the Arctic Ocean from the Canadian mainland. From there, they might be able to use boats to travel downstream to Hudson's Bay Company outposts, or they might encounter indigenous peoples who could provide assistance or guidance. The logistics of abandoning ship in the Arctic are extraordinarily complex. The survivors couldn't carry all their remaining supplies. They had to make decisions about what was essential. They would have taken boats, mounted on sledges so they could be hauled across ice and snow, but used for river travel if they reached open water. They would have taken food, firearms for hunting, navigational instruments, and whatever else they could carry. The weight of these supplies distributed among 105 men who were likely already weakened by malnutrition, lead poisoning, scurvy, and other ailments would have made travel brutally slow and exhausting. The route they chose, south toward the Back River, was based on the best geographical knowledge available to them, but it was optimistic about distances and conditions. From where the ships were abandoned, the distance to the nearest Hudson's Bay Company post was well over 1,000 miles, much of it across terrain with no established trails through a region where game might be scarce in early spring when weather conditions were still hostile. The expedition members were sailors, not experienced Arctic land travellers. Their equipment and training were oriented towards shipboard life, not extended overland marching. What happened next can only be reconstructed from fragments. Inuit hunters and travellers encountered evidence of the expedition's passage, and in some cases may have met survivors directly. These accounts, collected by later search expeditions and preserved in Inuit oral history, describe finding abandoned equipment, boats and bodies in various locations across King William Island and the adjacent mainland. The accounts mention tracks in the snow, campsites, and the impression of men travelling in groups, hauling heavy sledges, moving slowly south. One of the most puzzling aspects revealed by this evidence is what the expedition members were carrying. Later, archaeological investigation found sledges loaded with items that seem inexplicable for a survival march: silverware, books, personal effects. One interpretation is that the officers and crew, weakened by cold and malnutrition and possibly impaired by lead poisoning, were making irrational decisions about what was essential. Another interpretation is that they were still thinking in terms of maintaining naval discipline and civilization as a psychological anchor, that the familiar objects of ordinary life represented continuity and order in a situation that was becoming increasingly desperate. The physical challenges of Arctic travel compound quickly. Cold temperatures require more calories to maintain body heat. Physical exertion, hauling loaded sledges across ice and snow, burns additional calories. Malnutrition and scurvy impair the body's ability to heal and maintain strength. The mathematics of this situation are unforgiving. The men were burning more energy than they could replace with their dwindling food supplies, meaning they were gradually consuming their own body mass as fuel. This process accelerates weakness, which makes travel slower, which extends the time required to reach safety, which requires more calories than they have. Scurvy, caused by vitamin C deficiency, was likely a major factor in the expedition's decline. Vitamin C is essential for collagen synthesis, the protein that holds tissues together. Without it, old wounds reopen, gums bleed, teeth loosen, and joints become painful. The psychological effects include depression and lethargy. The expedition's tinned foods, while preventing other forms of spoilage, didn't preserve vitamin C well. Fresh meat can provide vitamin C, but hunting in the Arctic requires energy, equipment, and luck, all of which would have been in short supply for weakened, desperate men. The final locations where evidence of the expedition was found trace a rough line southward from where the ships were abandoned. Bodies and artefacts were discovered at scattered points on King's William Island and on the Adelaide Peninsula of the mainland. The pattern suggests that the group may have fragmented, some men dying earlier and being left behind, others pushing forward in smaller groups. The expedition dissolving from an organised unit into isolated survivors attempting to reach safety independently. None survived. The last confirmed evidence of the expedition comes from Inuit accounts and from scattered remains found by search parties. over subsequent decades. No written accounts beyond the Victory Point note were ever recovered. No survivors reached any outpost or settlement to tell their story. The expedition disappeared into the Arctic and was consumed by it, becoming one of the most enduring mysteries of 19th century exploration. The aftermath began almost immediately. When the expedition failed to return by 1847, or send word by 1848, concern grew in Britain. The Royal Navy launched the first search expeditions in 1848, sending ships back into the Arctic to look for traces of Franklin and his men. These searches continued for more than a decade, becoming their own extensive chapters of Arctic exploration. The searches found the graves at Beechey Island, the note at Victory Point, and scattered artefacts and remains, but they never found the ships themselves or any comprehensive record of what happened. The searches did make contact with Inuit communities, and it was from Inuit testimony that much of the information about the expedition's final months was gathered. These accounts described encounters with weakened Europeans, sightings of abandoned camps and equipment, and the discovery of bodies. For many years, some European searchers were skeptical of these accounts, preferring to believe that the expedition might still be found alive, or that written records might provide a more authoritative explanation. This skepticism reflected colonial attitudes about the reliability of indigenous knowledge, but the Inuit accounts have been consistently vindicated by physical evidence found later. The Franklin expedition became a cultural phenomenon in Victorian Britain, a story about heroic exploration, about civilization confronting wilderness, about loss and mystery. Ballads were written, monuments erected, and the fate of the expedition debated in newspapers and lecture halls. Lady Franklin, Sir John's widow, campaigned vigorously for continued searches and for recognition of her husband's achievements. The expedition took on symbolic weight beyond its original purpose, becoming a story about perseverance, sacrifice, and the limits of human ambition. From a scientific perspective, the expedition's tragedy provided painful lessons about Arctic travel. Subsequent explorers learned from Franklin's mistakes, relying more on indigenous knowledge, travelling lighter, understanding better the dangers of scurvy and the importance of fresh food, and being more cautious about committing fully to untested routes. The search expeditions, while failing to rescue Franklin's men, significantly expanded European knowledge of Arctic geography, mapping large portions of the archipelago and demonstrating which routes were and weren't viable. The ships themselves remained missing for more than a century and a half. HMS Erebus and HMS Terror had vanished into the ice and, despite extensive searches, no one could locate them. The Arctic had proven capable of hiding two substantial naval vessels so completely that their location became a matter of speculation and theory. Some researchers believed the ships had been crushed by ice and sunk in deep water. Others thought they might have drifted after being abandoned, carried by currents and ice to locations far from where they were last known to be. The breakthrough came from combining modern technology with Inuit traditional knowledge. Parks Canada, the Canadian government agency responsible for historic sites, conducted systematic underwater searches in the areas where Inuit accounts and historical records suggested the ships might have gone down. In September 2014, using sonar equipment and remotely operated vehicles, searchers located HMS Erebus in Terror Bay, south of King William Island, in relatively shallow water. The ship was remarkably well preserved, sitting upright on the seafloor, its structure largely intact despite more than a century and a half underwater in the Arctic. 2 years later, in September 2016, HMS Terror was found in Terror Bay, about 60 kilometres north of where Erebus had been discovered. Terror was in even better condition. The ship was intact, sitting upright, and appeared to have settled gently to the bottom rather than being violently wrecked. The discovery of both ships confirmed that they hadn't been destroyed, where they were abandoned in 1848. Instead, they had somehow moved south, whether by drifting in ice after abandonment, or possibly being briefly reoccupied by some of the crew attempting to return. The ship's final resting places were closer to the mainland, in locations that suggested they might have been attempting to reach safety even after being abandoned. The discovery of the wrecks brings a kind of resolution to the mystery, though not in the sense of answering every question. The ships proved that the expedition was real, that the vessels existed and travelled where the records suggest. The preservation of the wrecks, particularly Terror, opens possibilities for future archaeology that might reveal more about what happened. Personal effects, ship's logs, or other artefacts might still be recoverable from the wrecks, potentially providing direct evidence about the expedition's final months. What the discoveries primarily demonstrate is the Arctic's capacity to preserve and to hide. The cold water and the remoteness of the location protected the wrecks from salvage or disturbance for more than 150 years. The ships rested on the seafloor in silence, maintaining their secrets, while above them the ice formed and melted seasonally, and the story of the expedition lived on in books, theories, and cultural memory. The Arctic proved patient and meticulous in its record-keeping, maintaining physical evidence that would eventually be found when technology and determination aligned. The Franklin expedition ultimately represents a collision between ambition and environment, between planning and unpredictability. The expedition was well prepared by the standards of 1845, provisioned, equipped, led by experienced officers, and pursuing a goal that seemed achievable. The Northwest Passage does exist. Ships can and have navigated through the Arctic archipelago. The expedition's failure wasn't because the goal was impossible, but because the specific conditions they encountered, ice patterns, weather, route choices, combined with technological limitations and some unfortunate decisions to create a situation from which there was no recovery. Understanding what went wrong requires holding multiple factors in tension. The lead from the tinned food contributed to cognitive impairment and physical weakness. The decision to use heavy sledges loaded with non-essential items suggests impaired judgment. The choice of route, heading south toward the Back River rather than attempting other directions, was based on incomplete geographic knowledge. The timing of abandoning the ships in April rather than waiting for summer may have been forced by deteriorating conditions aboard. Each factor individually might have been manageable, but in combination, in the specific environment of the Arctic, they became fatal. The human dimension of the tragedy is worth acknowledging with care. Each of the 129 men who sailed with the expedition had lives, families, and aspirations. They were professionals doing a job that was understood to be dangerous, but also important and potentially prestigious. Arctic exploration in the 1840s was considered a worthy endeavour, scientifically valuable, economically significant if a Northwest Passage could be established, and emblematic of British naval prowess. The men who joined the expedition weren't naive about the risks, but they trusted in preparation, leadership, and collective capability to see them through. The Arctic itself isn't malevolent. It's simply an environment governed by physical laws that don't accommodate human needs. The cold is thermodynamics. The ice forms and melts according to patterns of solar radiation, ocean currents, and atmospheric circulation. The distances are geometric facts. The lack of food is ecology. The Arctic supports less biomass than temperate regions because the growing season is so short and primary productivity is limited. When we say the Arctic defeated the Franklin expedition, we're using metaphor to describe the simple reality that the environment's demands exceeded the expedition's capacity to meet them. Modern Arctic travel, even in the same regions where Franklin's expedition met its end, is vastly safer because of technology, knowledge, and infrastructure. Satellite communication means that isolated parties can call for rescue. GPS navigation eliminates the uncertainty about position and route. Modern insulated clothing and portable shelters provide better protection from cold. Icebreakers can force passages through ice that would have trapped 19th century ships indefinitely. Knowledge of nutrition prevents scurvy. Understanding of hypothermia and frostbite allows better management of cold exposure. All of these advantages are built on the accumulated experience of previous expeditions, including the painful lessons from failures like Franklin's. Yet the Arctic remains a place where human presence is maintained through constant effort and resource expenditure. Communities in the Arctic exist because of regular supply chains, because of technology that can create warmth and shelter in environments where the natural conditions would be fatal, and because of knowledge systems, both indigenous knowledge developed over millennia and scientific knowledge about Arctic conditions that allow people to read the environment and make safe decisions. The Arctic tolerates human presence, but requires constant attention and respect. The indigenous peoples of the Arctic, including the Inuit, who encountered evidence of the Franklin expedition, have lived in these regions for thousands of years. Their survival is based on sophisticated knowledge systems that include understanding seasonal patterns, animal behaviour, ice conditions, and weather. The technologies they developed, clothing made from animal skins that provides better insulation than most 19th century European garments, transportation methods like dog sleds that are well suited to snow and ice, hunting techniques adapted to Arctic prey, represent generations of accumulated expertise. The Franklin expedition's tragedy in part reflects the failure to adequately incorporate this existing knowledge. Later explorers who learned from indigenous Arctic peoples were consistently more successful. The story of the Franklin expedition also illustrates how we process historical mysteries. For more than a century and a half, the expedition's fate was a matter of speculation, theory, and incomplete information. Different researchers emphasized different aspects. Some focused on lead poisoning, others on scurvy, others on leadership failures or bad luck with ice conditions. The search for the ships became a kind of quest narrative, with Parks Canada's successful discoveries in 2014 and 2016 representing resolution. Yet this resolution doesn't provide complete answers. We still don't know the day-to-day experience of the crew during those final years. We don't know what conversations occurred, what decisions were debated, what individual fates befell specific men. The mystery has been partially solved but remains partially opaque, which perhaps is fitting for events that occurred in such an isolated, unwitnessed place. Archaeological investigation of the wrecks continues, conducted carefully to preserve the sites and to respect them as grave sites. The discoveries have generated new questions even as they've answered old ones. Why did the ships move south from where they were abandoned? Were they briefly reoccupied? Did they drift in ice? How much of their contents remain preserved? What artifacts might be recovered that could illuminate the expedition's final months? These questions drive ongoing research, combining historical scholarship, archaeological method, and modern technology like underwater robotics and remote sensing. The broader context of Arctic exploration helps situate the Franklin expedition within a larger pattern. The 19th century saw numerous expeditions attempting to map the Arctic, to find the Northwest Passage, and to reach the North Pole. Many of these expeditions involved hardship. Some involved deaths, and a few involved disasters comparable to Franklin's. The persistence of exploration, despite these dangers, reflects both the scientific curiosity of the era and the geopolitical and economic motivations underlying Arctic exploration. Britain, along with other nations, was interested in Arctic routes for trade, in scientific knowledge, and in the prestige associated with geographic discovery. Climate change has transformed the Arctic since Franklin's time. The ice that trapped Erebus and Terror is now much reduced in extent and thickness. The Northwest Passage, which was effectively impassable for most ships in the 19th century, is now navigable during summer months for icebreakers and specially equipped vessels. This change reflects global warming caused by increased atmospheric carbon dioxide from human industrial activity. The Arctic is warming faster than lower latitudes, a phenomenon called Arctic amplification, which is driven by feedback loops involving ice, melt, changes in surface reflectivity, and atmospheric circulation patterns. The opening of Arctic waters due to climate change brings its own complexities, new opportunities for shipping and resource extraction, but also ecological disruption, loss of sea ice that Arctic wildlife depends on, and new geopolitical tensions as nations contest rights to newly accessible waters. The Franklin expedition's struggle against impenetrable ice belongs to an Arctic that's rapidly disappearing, being replaced by an Arctic that's increasingly accessible, but also fundamentally altered from its historical condition. From a purely scientific standpoint, the Franklin expedition represents a data point in understanding human physiological and psychological limits in extreme environments. The combination of cold, isolation, malnutrition, and stress creates predictable patterns of decline. The body prioritizes core temperature and vital organ function, drawing resources from less critical systems. Cognitive function becomes impaired, first through fatigue and stress, then through malnutrition affecting brain chemistry, and potentially through toxic exposures like lead. Social structures can either support or undermine survival. Strong leadership and group cohesion help maintain discipline and hope, while breakdown of these structures accelerates decline. Modern understanding of these factors comes partly from studying historical expeditions, like Franklin's, and partly from controlled research and observation of people in extreme environments, Antarctic research stations, high-altitude expeditions, survival situations. The medical knowledge about hypothermia, frostbite, starvation, and psychological stress in isolation is now sophisticated enough that we can reconstruct with reasonable accuracy what the Franklin expedition members would have experienced physiologically and mentally during their final months. The equipment failures that contributed to the expedition's troubles, particularly the lead solder in the tinned food, highlight how technological innovation can introduce unforeseen risks. Canning was a recent technology in 1845, and while it successfully prevented bacterial spoilage, the lead contamination wasn't recognized as a hazard. This pattern repeats throughout technological history. New methods solve one problem but create others that only become apparent with time and experience. The lesson isn't to avoid innovation, but to maintain humility about how well we understand the full consequences of our tools and methods. The narrative arc of the Franklin expedition: preparation, initial success, gradual deterioration, crisis, and final dissolution, follows patterns seen in other exploration disasters and in survival situations more generally. There's typically an early phase where training, supplies, and morale sustain hope. A middle phase where challenges mount and initial resources deplete. A crisis point where it becomes clear that the original plan won't work. And a final phase where the situation either resolves through rescue, successful adaptation, or tragic conclusion. Understanding these patterns doesn't diminish the specific tragedy of Franklin's expedition, but it does place it within a comprehensible framework of how humans respond to extreme adversity. The cultural memory of the expedition has evolved over time. In Victorian Britain, it was initially framed as heroic tragedy, brave men sacrificing for scientific and national glory. Later interpretations emphasised the hubris of European explorers, ignoring indigenous knowledge, or the tragedy of men lost due to avoidable technological failures. Contemporary understanding tries to honour the human loss, while also learning from the mistakes, recognising both the courage of the individuals involved and the systemic failures that contributed to their deaths. The fact that the expedition's fate remained unknown for so long, and that evidence emerged only gradually over more than a century, created space for myths and speculation. Theories ranged from the plausible to the fantastical. Some suggested the crew had been murdered by indigenous peoples, a theory unsupported by evidence and rooted in racist assumptions. Others proposed that survivors might have integrated into Inuit communities, though no evidence supports this either. The actual evidence, when finally assembled, pointed to the simpler and more tragic explanation. The expedition was trapped by ice, weakened by malnutrition and disease, and died attempting to reach safety across impossible distances. The preservation of the wrecks in cold Arctic waters means that they exist now as time capsules containing artifacts and potentially documents from 1845-1848 that have been protected from decay by the same conditions that killed the crew. This preservation allows modern investigation, but also creates ethical questions about how to handle what is essentially a mass grave. The wrecks belong to Canada, found in Canadian waters, but they're also sites of British historical interest and, most importantly, final resting places for the 129 men who died. Balancing archaeological investigation with respect for the dead requires careful consideration. The technical aspects of finding the wrecks, the sonar surveys, the underwater archaeology, the combination of historical research and modern technology represent their own achievement. The search area was vast, the water conditions challenging, and the ships could have been anywhere within a region of thousands of square kilometres. The successful discovery depended on systematically narrowing the search area using Inuit testimony about where ships had been seen or where items from the expedition had been found, then conducting methodical surveys until the sonar detected anomalies that turned out to be the wrecks. This process demonstrates how indigenous knowledge and modern technology can work together to solve historical mysteries. For the Inuit communities whose traditional territories include King William Island and the surrounding waters, the Franklin expedition is part of their history too. Inuit oral history preserved accounts of encountering the expedition or finding evidence of it, accounts that were eventually proven accurate. The discoveries of the wrecks have involved Inuit participation and input, recognising their role as knowledge keepers and their connection to the land and waters where these events occurred. This represents a shift from earlier eras when European explorers often discounted or ignored indigenous perspectives. The scientific value of studying the Franklin expedition extends beyond just understanding what happened to these specific ships and men. It provides insight into 19th century naval practices, technology, and culture. The artifacts recovered from the wrecks and from expedition campsites offer physical evidence of daily life aboard exploration ships. The human remains, studied respectfully and with appropriate protocols, provide medical and anthropological information about health, diet, and the physical effects of Arctic conditions. Each piece of evidence adds to our understanding of both this specific event and the broader patterns of human behaviour and biology in extreme environments. One of the most persistent questions about the expedition is whether it could have succeeded if conditions had been slightly different. If the ice had broken up in the summer of 1847, freeing the ships to continue, would they have found the Northwest Passage? If they had turned back after the first winter, instead of pushing forward, could they have returned safely to Britain? If they had better understood the dangers of their tinned food or made different decisions about rationing and hunting, might more have survived the final march? These counterfactuals are ultimately unanswerable, but they highlight how narrow the margin between success and failure can be in extreme environments, and how cascading failures, one problem creating another, which creates another, can overwhelm even well-prepared expeditions. The Northwest Passage that Franklin sought is now regularly traversed by ships, though it remains challenging and requires icebreaker support or specially equipped vessels. The route isn't economically significant for commercial shipping in the way 19th century planners hoped. It's still slower and more hazardous than southern routes, but it exists as a navigable waterway during summer months. In this sense, Franklin's goal was achievable, just not with the technology and knowledge available in 1845. The long silence after the expedition disappeared, years during which Britain didn't know whether the ships were still progressing, trapped, or destroyed, created its own kind of suffering for the families of the crew members. Letters were written that would never be delivered. Hopes were maintained long after any realistic possibility of survival had passed. The searches that were launched brought back fragments of information, each piece both confirming fears and raising new questions. This prolonged uncertainty, the slow revelation of tragedy, became part of the expedition's legacy. From a physical oceanography perspective, the waters where the ships were trapped are interesting because they represent a transition zone between the relatively open waters of the Western Arctic and the ice-choked channels of the Arctic archipelago. Ocean currents, air temperature, and the presence of land all influence ice formation and movement. The ships were caught in an area where multiple factors conspired to keep ice consolidated rather than breaking up seasonally. Understanding these ice dynamics, how sea ice forms, how it moves, what causes it to break up or persist, has been crucial for modern Arctic navigation and for predicting how the Arctic will respond to climate change. The psychology of the expedition's final months invites consideration, but resists definitive conclusions. We can imagine the discussions among officers about when to abandon ship, the debates about what to carry, the calculations about rations and distances. We can infer the deteriorating morale, the deaths that must have demoralized survivors, the physical weakness that made every day's march an ordeal. But the actual thoughts and feelings of the men remain inaccessible. The note at Victory Point gives us only the barest facts, written in official language that reveals little of the emotional reality behind the decisions. The role of scurvy in the expedition's decline deserves particular attention because it was a preventable condition, though the prevention wasn't well understood in 1845. Vitamin C is readily available in fresh foods, including fresh meat if organ meats are consumed, and many Arctic animals could have provided it. The expedition's failure to hunt successfully enough to supplement their tinned provisions, combined with the poor vitamin C content of those preserved foods, created the conditions for widespread scurvy. By the time the disease became severe, the crew would have been too weak to hunt effectively, creating a vicious cycle of declining health and declining ability to obtain the fresh food that could have reversed the decline. Temperature's effects on human physiology are relentless. The body burns calories to maintain core temperature. Heat is being constantly lost to the environment and must be constantly regenerated through metabolism. In extreme cold, this heat loss accelerates, requiring more food to fuel metabolic heat production. The expedition members, hauling heavy sledges across ice while inadequately nourished, were burning far more calories than they could replace, essentially consuming their own bodies as fuel. This process leads to muscle wasting, weakness, impaired immune function, and eventually the inability to continue moving, combined with scurvy, cold injury, and likely some degree of lead poisoning affecting judgment and coordination. The physical deterioration would have been rapid once it began. The final locations where bodies and artifacts were found suggest that the expedition did fragment as it travelled south. Some men died earlier and were buried or left where they fell. Others continued, possibly in smaller groups, each group making its own decisions about route and pace. This fragmentation is common in survival situations where a large group proves impossible to move and supply as a unit. Breaking into smaller parties can be rational. Smaller groups can move faster and require less food, but it also means losing the collective strength and skills of the full group. The question of why no one survived to reach safety involves both distance and condition. The nearest Hudson's Bay Company posts were more than 1,000 miles away across trackless terrain. Even healthy, well-supplied men travelling in summer would have found this journey challenging. Weakened, inadequately equipped men travelling in spring, hauling boats and supplies, with no clear trails to follow and limited ability to hunt, faced nearly impossible odds. The arithmetic of the situation, distance to cover, speed of travel, available food, rate of physical decline, didn't add up to survival. Modern emergency rescue in the Arctic depends on technology that didn't exist in 1845. Aircraft that can reach remote locations quickly, satellite communication that allows stranded parties to call for help, weather forecasting that helps avoid the worst conditions, and medical knowledge that enables treatment of cold injury, hypothermia, and malnutrition. Without any of these advantages, the Franklin expedition members were entirely dependent on their own resources and on reaching safety through their own efforts, a challenge that proved too great. The Arctic environment preserves evidence in ways that other environments don't. Bodies that would decay rapidly in temperate climates remain frozen in permafrost. Artifacts made of materials that would rust or rot in moist conditions remain intact in the dry cold. Wooden ships sunk in cold water are protected from the organisms that would consume them in warmer seas. This preservation has allowed modern investigation to recover evidence that would otherwise have been lost, turning the Arctic itself into an archive that maintains records of human activity across centuries. The intersection of indigenous knowledge and European exploration remains one of the important lessons from the Franklin story. Inuit hunters and travellers understood ice conditions, seasonal patterns, and the locations of game. They had clothing and technology adapted to Arctic conditions. Later European explorers who learned from Inuit knowledge were more successful. Franklin's expedition, operating with British naval procedures and equipment without adequate integration of local knowledge, was at a significant disadvantage. This isn't to say that Inuit knowledge could have guaranteed success. The Arctic is dangerous even for those who know it well, but it certainly could have improved the expedition's chances. The cultural production inspired by the Franklin expedition, the ballads, novels, paintings, and memorials, reflects how Victorian Britain processed the tragedy. It was cast as a story of heroism and sacrifice, of men dying in service to science and nation. This framing served psychological and political purposes, turning loss into meaning, but it sometimes obscured the simpler reality that the expedition failed due to a combination of bad luck, technological limitations, and mistaken decisions. Modern retellings tend to be more critical, examining what went wrong and why, but they still struggle with the fundamental inscrutability of events that left no detailed record. The ships themselves, now resting on the Arctic seafloor, continue to hold information that hasn't yet been recovered. Future archaeological expeditions may enter the wrecks and find logs, journals, or other documents that could provide first-hand accounts of what happened. They might find personal effects that illuminate who these men were beyond their names on crew lists. Each artifact recovered adds detail to our understanding, though it's unlikely that any discovery will completely dispel the mystery or fully answer every question about the expedition's final months. The long-term impact of the Franklin disaster on Arctic exploration was significant. It demonstrated the limits of relying on technology and provisions alone. Without adequate understanding of local conditions and indigenous knowledge, it showed the dangers of lead contamination in food supplies, leading to changes in canning technology. It provided cautionary lessons about route selection, timing, and the importance of flexibility in planning. These lessons, learned at tremendous cost, contributed to safer practices for later expeditions. The fact that both wrecks were found in relatively shallow water, largely intact, suggests that they settled to the bottom gradually rather than being catastrophically destroyed by ice. This raises intriguing possibilities about their final voyages after being abandoned. Did they drift in pack ice released from their initial trapped position, but carried by currents and ice movement? Were they briefly reoccupied by some of the crew, attempting to return or seeking shelter? The physical evidence from the wrecks may eventually answer these questions, but for now, they remain matters of speculation and ongoing investigation. In the end, the Franklin expedition stands as a profound example of human ambition meeting environmental reality. The men who sailed in 1845 were well-trained, well-equipped by the standards of their time, and pursuing a worthwhile goal. They weren't reckless or naive, but the combination of factors they faced, the particular ice conditions of those years, the lead contamination in their food, the distances involved, the limitations of their technology and knowledge, created a situation from which there was no escape. The Arctic kept their ships for more than 170 years, silent and intact, until technology and persistence finally located them, bringing partial resolution to a mystery that has fascinated and haunted people for generations. The story reminds us that, even with careful planning and brave effort, some environments demand more than we can provide, and the consequences of miscalculation can be absolute and final. The next story is about to begin. Please relax and enjoy.